Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening. We have a truly global audience today. So thank you for joining us for this first virtual LSE public lecture since the cancellation of the regular public lecture program earlier this year. And thank you for bearing with us as we also try to run this large event virtually. Well, LSE is exactly as empty as it looks on the image behind me. The last parts of the schools were closed last week, and our students are scattered all over, but many of them back in their home countries. And of course, as you know, each country is in a different phase of the epidemic curves. I know that some of you are following this from wherever you are. Just to reassure you that we are thinking of you as you know, we are still teaching this week. Of course, it's all virtual, but we are really trying our best to keep teaching going. This is the last week. And like other faculty, I'm confined to my home, and we are doing our best to make sure that we can continue to deliver to our students, but also to keep up with other obligations. And of course, the demand from policymakers is extremely strong right now, and we are all struggling to understand this virus and the impact it is having on our lives and in different parts of the world. So this evolving crisis has forced us all to adjust and to improvise. It's just not possible to have this kind of policy seminar really discussing any policy issue at this time without relating it to the crisis. And that's what we are doing today, and that's what we are going to do as we roll out our events over the next few months. Today we want to look at the historical experience and see what we can learn for the current crisis. I will be very brief in my introduction to give our speakers enough time and allow for questions and answers. We have a very large number of people on today's call, and I ask you to mute your phones when you're not speaking. If you want to ask questions, you can raise your hand, use the raise your hand function in Zoom, and we'll try to do our best to keep track of that. When you ask a question, please introduce yourself and your affiliation. It helps to keep track for those who don't see you and are listening maybe later. So for today's event, we have asked Professor Harold James of Princeton University and one of the leading historians on economic and financial reconstruction to look at lessons from history for how to recover from deep shocks like the one that we are currently going through. We also asked LSE's own Professor Ethan Ilsetsky from the economics department, who has worked on war economies and post-war reconstruction, to give some comments. We are very grateful that they have both agreed to speak to us today. Harold, it's a great honor to have you back here at the LSE, not in person, but in spirit and in image and voice. It's the second best, as so many things are these days. We are forced to accept these things as we are adjusting to this current reality. But we're very much looking forward to your presentation. The virtual floor is yours, Harold.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. Good afternoon to you in London. Good day everywhere in the world. I'm delighted to be with you. I hope you're well, and I hope you stay well. We're at the moment at a really turning point in the development of the corona crisis. The infections are escalating in many countries, but we're hoping that the social distancing applied is going to slow down the course of the epidemic. And the problem, I think, at the moment is that we have to think of a number of different time horizons at the same time. We're obviously desperately concerned with how to manage this particular crisis. But while we're managing the crisis, we're also going to be more and more worried about what the world looks like afterwards. And so it's a question of balancing those two perspectives of immediate crisis management and thinking of a long-term future. And that relationship is really extraordinarily difficult to deal with. When we think about these issues, I think it's inevitable. Whenever you're faced with something that's uncertain and problematic, you look for some kind of historical example. That's what I wanted to share with you over the next minutes. I'm going to try to share the screen now so that I can show you some slides. There are two kinds of analogies that are being made. One is to do with past pandemics or plagues. The other is to do with wars. There have been a number of papers. Some of them have been written just over the last days, over the last weeks, on the lessons of the Black Death or the lessons of the so-called Spanish influenza at the end of the First World War. So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is the kind of mobilization that took place in wartime, and particularly in the great conflicts of the 20th century, in the First World War and the Second World War. And the kind of analogies to war are being more and more frequently made. So it's a standby of any political speech. Xi Jinping at the beginning of February talked about this as a people's war, but everywhere you hear the same kind of statement. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we must act like a wartime government and do whatever it takes to support our economy. The question, if you think that you're really in a wartime setting, this is a very different kind of war. The enemy is not another country, it's not people, it's invisible to the naked eye. We're not really clear when we can see what victory or defeat is, because it may well be that, like the pandemics of the past, like the Black Death, or like the Spanish influenza, that these will be recurring pandemics. They may occur in more or less severe forms, but the bubonic plague really continued to ravage Europe until the 18th century. In the 18th century, there was a kind of protective mechanism that gave some kind of barrier against the Black Death. The militarized frontier between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire really stopped the transmission, but the plague was still endemic in the Ottoman Empire into the 19th century. So the enemy is going to be around for a long time. Another question, I think, is this is an unprecedented test for international solidarity. The impetus in any kind of crisis like this is to think that we can deal with this best in our own setting, in a national setting. Sometimes we see it in the United States as well, that it's actually the state governments rather than the federal government that are at the forefront of the response. But you need to think of working with other countries. There are supply chains that are cross-border, that are across the country, international. The supply of medication and so on is international. And above all, I think, and that's what I wanted to focus on really, is the question of the relationship between short-term measures and longer-term planning for a post-war period. So plagues involve a severe demographic loss, much, much heavier than any calculation of what the likely number of victims will be from the current virus. The Black Death in Europe reduced the population by about a third. That's still true when the plague is coming back in the 17th century. They had a severe long-term impact. I think the current understanding is that the decline of Italy in the 17th century is in large measure a consequence of the plague epidemics in the first part of the century. And the long-term rate of return on capital is depressed. Wars, on the other hand, are characterized by the destruction of capital goods, but there's often a really quite strong recovery afterwards. So I'm going to think first of all of the immediate response, and then I'm going to think about the post-war order and try to integrate those at the end. So first of all, the immediate response, a wartime episode requires an unprecedented kind of mobilization, a central direction of resources, and you can think very clearly, I believe, in the kind of analogies, and it's actually discussed in the United States particularly as using the 1950 Defense Production Act to set priorities and allocations, to expand the productive capacity and supply. And the 1950 Act allows for a reorganization of industry in order to get the supply going. So that's thinking about the development of what the hospitals need at the moment, personal protective equipment, disinfection material, diagnostic testing, testing for antibodies, quite soon, perhaps antiviral drugs. But this involves factories that were doing other things, making ventilators now, making face masks in clothing factories. So it can be done by some kind of voluntary coordination, but it's likely to be done in a centrally coordinated way. And that's exactly the wartime analogy. So I think this is widely known. But there are other features of a wartime mobilization that I think are only beginning to creep into the consciousness as we discuss the response to the coronavirus. That is that it is particularly clear in the Second World War, in part that was a lesson from the First World War, that civilian morale is enormously important. It's a critical part of the war economy. And you can lose the war on the home front as well as on the battlefield. And there was a kind of belief in many countries that the decisive measures in the First World War had actually been concerned with the degree of effectiveness of domestic mobilization. So that was a case of supplying food to people, but also to supplying food in a way that looked as if it was equitable. You didn't want to see the rich living a life of extravagance, consumption, and luxury when other people were short of food. And the rationing systems that were designed in the Second World War were designed in part to alleviate the first problem of inadequate supply, but also to deal with the second problem about the perception of injustice. And we're seeing exactly that kind of issue emerge at the moment. When you look at this is just grabbed from an online newspaper, the discussion about hoarding at the beginning of the coronavirus and then throwing away large quantities of food because they'd spoiled as a result of excessive hoarding. This is exactly what's pushing that kind of discussion. And you can see that that was done. There was hoarding at the beginning of the war, and there was a worry that some people were doing better than others, some people were getting away with things. So there's a question of rationing, providing fair shares. So this is something that I think you may well find as the lockdowns in different countries go into several weeks, months. That's exactly where the problem will appear. and there will be a really sense that some people get the access to the resources other people don't, and it may be that a effective policy response requires a guarantee that people will have access to goods, but people will also be able to afford them. Because one of the features I think that we see very, very dramatically is that there are some people who are getting salaries that are continued to be paid. There are some people on official short-term working schemes, but there are some people who had casual employment before who are actually really desperate and are running out of money. That's something that needs to be dealt with, and the response needs to be quite quick and quite effective. A third feature of the wartime story is the story of the mobilization of people. We have that today in the modern analogy. There's a front of nurses and doctors, hospital staff, but there's also everybody involved in supply chains, in the maintenance of public order. And we can see in some areas where there has been already a long habituation with the problem of the virus and infections, the breakdown of public order. This is a screenshot from a riot in Wuhan at the end of March. But the question of whether public order can be maintained through an extended pandemic is clearly going to be, as we get into more and more into the emergency, something that we think more about. And then finally, Ethan has thought a lot about this as well, there are the fiscal monetary consequences of this, and that I think is probably where the idea of the wartime response was shaped very quickly, that there's been a big fiscal response across the major industrial economies. Emerging markets are doing the same kind of thing, and there's almost a worldwide pattern, which is a fiscal stimulus, but then absorbing it on the balance sheet of central banks. This is the additional spending in the UK. You can see at the moment of the fiscal responses, the response in the US looks as if it's the largest in proportion to GDP, and the president is just talking about doubling that fiscal response at the moment. It will be taken largely onto the balance sheet of central banks, and that is immediately reminiscent of the wartime mobilizations. The central bank balance sheets are already very extended in the aftermath of the financial crisis. This is the ECB balance sheet with a promise of taking on more. And a few days ago, you saw, I think, a really quite dramatic op-ed piece by Mario Draghi in the Financial Times, where Draghi looked into the future and thought about how much higher public debt levels will become a permanent feature of our economies and will be accompanied, he said, by private debt cancellation. And looking at the past, he then said during the First World War in Italy and Germany, between 6 and 8% of war spending in real terms was financed from taxes. I'm not sure about those figures. Those figures are still the subject of intense discussion, but it is certainly the case that only a very, very small proportion of the wartime expenditure in both world wars, but particularly in the First World War. The Second World War was better at doing this. It was in part a question of drawing lessons from the First World War. It was much less financed from taxes.
Vänta, you can hear.
So those are other calculations about the expenditure from the budget. But you can see, I think, how as the war goes on, the deficits mount, deficits as a share of expenditure in the United Kingdom and France, Germany. Germany, by the last year of the war, over 90% is financed directly through the printing press. It's less in the United States, it's less in the United Kingdom. And it has everywhere inflationary consequences. So over the past decade, one of the big policy dilemmas has been how to restart some kind of level of inflation in order to get out of deflation. Wartime financing and the massive taking of public debt onto the balance sheet of central banks has an inflationary impact. And it's difficult to see how that inflationary impact is going to be avoided. That's what I want to deal with right at the end of the presentation. So let me think in the second part of the presentation about a longer term vision. First of all, what happens to supply chains? We are in a globalized world, we were in a globalized world, but in the course of responding to the crisis, there has been a big demand to have medical supplies, pharmaceuticals more accessible locally and to be less dependent on the apparent benevolence or possibly politically motivated donations from other countries. At the moment, for instance, there's a struggle about whether the Europeans should accept face masks that are made in Taiwan. We're seeing in a really graphic way the way in which the world pharmaceutical supply chains are basically dependent on China. Most generics, when they're imported, are imported from India, but they depend on supplies that are also coming from China. Is that going to end as a result of the epidemic? Is everybody going to say that they need to ensure that they can supply themselves? It's hardly feasible to even think that. It may just be possible for a large country, the United States, or a large middle-sized country, the United Kingdom, or France or Germany, or Italy, to make those kind of supplies. But if you think about Latvia or Slovenia producing a full range of antibiotics, it's absolutely an incredible thought. So that's not going to happen. So thinking about the longer term future, we're going to have to learn lessons from this particular episode of how to really integrate a secure supply chain so that we don't get shortages and we don't get questions about how scarce resources are allocated and which country is favored or which area of the country is favored in the moment of an emergency. A second longer term feature, I think, is that although we're all allies in this, and countries need to work together in order to fight the coronavirus, there's also a sense in which they're rivals. And the crisis is going to be remembered, and it's going to be presented in a very simple visual way. So all of you who have thought about the European debt crisis over the last 10 years will know that there's a chart that everybody shows about the European debt crisis that shows the spread of government bonds. That's the way in which you see where governments are. The competition in this particular case is to get the less steep curve for the rising rates of infection and the rising rates of mortality. And if you look at this at the moment, that you can see that South Korea and Japan look as if they're the unambiguous winners of this, and the United States, the UK, France, and Spain look more vulnerable. People are going to make judgments, in other words, about the extent of the effectiveness of the public policy response. They're going to use curves like this to evaluate the response of governments as a whole. It's not just the health system, but it's the way in which information is used. That's a key to the way in which South Korea handled the crisis. And the discussion of this, I believe, will be to push countries to be more like the successful cases, to be more like South Korea, and less like the unsuccessful cases. We're going to face also big questions about particular industries. I just thought of one which is particularly obvious, and it's at the center of the discussion of the crisis response in the United States, the future of the transport and aviation industry. It's unlikely that there will be a recovery very soon. Transport may be completely shut down for some time, but when it recovers, it will recover in the end, but it is unlikely to be on the scale that it was before. And the question is, how do you plan that? That was a question that arose in the wartime mobilizations of the 20th century. It was a very obvious question. How's the world going to be connected after the war? What's civil aviation going to do? And the answers that were provided at that time were really spectacularly wrong-headed. And there's a really famous version of this, is the Brabazon committee created during the war to design a future plane to think about the needs of aviation in the British Empire, the British Commonwealth, and came out with this. This is a prototype that was built in 1950. It's a really beautiful aircraft. It's about the size of the Airbus 300, spectacularly bigger than anything, but absolutely uneconomic. And the story of the Brabazon, I think, brings home one very clear lesson, which is that governments are very, very central in mobilizing for the war, but can be very poor in terms of thinking about the post-war future. So this was technically great, but commercially absolutely unviable. And so in terms of thinking about the future, you need to think of a system that allows a whole range of initiatives. In other words, something like a market economy to function. It's much better than the kind of planning system that's adopted for the immediate necessities of the war. And finally, post-war monetary and fiscal management. In this case, absolutely at the center of policy becomes the question of the management of government debt and consequently of interest rate policies. You can think of alternative strategies being used to do what Mario Draghi was suggesting, getting rid of the high levels of debt after the war. It can be done by high levels of inflation, but that, if you think of the legacy of the First World War, was a recipe for disaster in Central Europe. The hyperinflations of the early 1920s in Austria, Hungary, Germany were an important part of the political destabilization of those countries. In the first instance, they look like an act of political stabilization, but it's another instance where something that looks as if it's holding you together in the short term, in the long run, is deeply undermining. Alternatively, debt cancellations or capital levies, charges on bank accounts, it's already been done in some countries in the response to the coronavirus. Russia has introduced a capital levy. So those are the alternatives. But we have to think also that this is in the world of the 21st century. It's clearly also a lesson of the global financial crisis, is that it's not just public debt that is a problem, but large amounts of corporate debt can be equally a problem. And we're going to see that problem of large-scale corporate debt and the challenges that that poses in big emerging market economies in China. It's in China where, in this comparison, the growth of non-financial corporate debt has been really high. Characteristically, when large-scale private debt becomes a problem, you often get a too big to fail discussion, and then a question of taking it onto the public balance sheet, and you expand the level of public debt as a consequence there too. So the question of whether this is sustainable or not depends absolutely on the interest rate policy, and that was at the heart of the fiscal management in the aftermath of both world wars, with rather different solutions. The First World War in Britain and the United States, big expansion of government debt taken onto the balance sheet of banks, of the central banks. The Federal Reserve really found its role in 1917. It had just been created a few years earlier, in 1914. It finds its role in buying government debt, and it deals then with federal bills. So what kind of solution do you have there? In the aftermath of the First World War, both Britain and the United States tried to return to normalcy very quickly with the dramatic post-war deflation. After the Second World War, the sense of learning from the First World War episode was that you don't want to do that again. And so the erosion of the post-war debt takes place over a much longer time frame through a combination of economic growth and the tolerance of a higher level of inflation, but not the kind of hyperinflations that Central Europe had in the First World War. So you can see this in the United States case really quite dramatically, how inflation shoots up in the aftermath of the First World War, but is then radically reduced in the early 1920s. And it coincides with a dramatic industrial contraction, a really short, severe slump in 1920, 1921, a contraction that's quicker than the contraction a decade later in the Great Depression. Thinking in terms of longer term perspectives, then I think that contrast to the First and Second World War experience shows you something that is important. It's important to operate on not just on government debt, on the numerator, but it's also important to think about what can provide economic growth. And the war stimulated all kinds of economic development, technical development, new working practices, pharmaceutical innovations. The spread of penicillin, for instance, is a consequence of the preparations in the Second World War for dealing with infections. And we might also think, if we want to draw contemporary analogies, about the way in which the emergency of the coronavirus will introduce productivity enhancing mechanisms, better ways of working together. The kind of discussion that we're having at the moment is an instance of that. But thinking also of getting more effective medical systems, it's making telemedicine much more important. That's a tremendously helpful development. So we're likely to see some kinds of transformation. And if we want to be optimistic, and we think of where we can get more productivity, more effective development, it's exactly in terms of learning from the successful cases. And the thought there is, look at the kind of data management that Korea does. Look at the kind of medical management. If you do this, you may have a growing economy that makes it possible to sustain higher levels of debt more easily without the dramatic pain and the discussion of who wins, who loses, which is absolutely characteristic of any kind of post-war discussion. Who's going to pay for the war? That's an issue that can be poisonous, and the only way of diffusing the poison of that kind of discussion is to get a higher level of growth. And so you really need to think concretely of what you can learn from this crisis in terms of getting effective and dynamic innovation. So those are some preliminary remarks, and I think Ethan is going to respond a little bit, but there's obviously a big room for discussion there. And thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, Ethan.
And thank you so much, Harold. It was very thoughtful and inspiring for our discussion. Ethan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for Harold, for your comments. You leave me in a very an enviable position to try to follow up on a very comprehensive discussion of the current situation and the analogies from previous historical episodes. So, I'd like to make my discussion relatively short to leave room for a broader discussion. And so I'll pick up on two issues that Harold raised. And, for the most part, I agree with everything that was said here, but I'll just sort of expand perhaps on a couple of these issues, if I can get these. And you see the slides, do you? Yes. Okay. So the first question is, as Harold pointed out, we entered into this crisis where, I'm sure many of the viewers today have no experience with high inflation in their lifetimes, where we have both, successfully tackled the problem of inflation that we were worried about deflation and an inability of central banks to restore inflation to targets. So an interesting feature of the current crisis is that we have mass unemployment alongside pockets of the economy that are clearly overheating. And so I quite agree with Harold that there is potential here to exit this episode with high rates of inflation. So I looked at the data this morning, and so far I'd say the inflation threat seems very limited. So there's a lot of talk about the pasta shortage here in the UK, and the supermarkets seem to show empty shelves. But if you look at wheat prices or other commodity prices, yes, they have increased quite a bit, but not yet to unusual levels. And so, perhaps we'll get just pregnant enough with inflation from this episode to deal with the previous deflationary situations rather than enter into a hyperinflationary world. I am more concerned, and I won't say much about this, but I think there's an enormous, a room for a whole other conference on the topic of how emerging markets and developing countries will cope with this crisis. And there I do see potential for hyperinflationary spirals in a few areas of the world. So I think for the most part, we may be at the end of the long non-inflationary global period. Harold also pointed out in ways in which debts were effectively repudiated in previous wars, and this is from work by Reinhardt and Srebrenica, who showed that much of the World War II debts were decreased after the war, but a lot of this happened through, and this is a figure of financial repression, with interest rates that were low, real interest rates that were low or negative, and so there was sort of an effective repudiation of debt in the post-war period, and I think the issue is, to come to the next slide, this shows sort of the distribution of real interest rates in this period of debt repudiation. That's the blue line, and we do see a lot of countries that had negative real interest rates. But this green line here is how we entered this current crisis. So we were already in a period with quantitative easing, with very low nominal interest rates, with low real interest rates, where effectively governments were being paid to borrow from the public. And so, this was already the status quo ante, and one can only imagine with the expansionary monetary policies that we've seen currently, that this will be a major part of how the debt is repaid. Now, a word of optimism on this is if we go back to this period of financial repression, in many other respects, this is a period that was extremely good economically. I mean, economic growth and productivity growth were extremely high. This was a period of growth for middle classes in North America and Europe and Japan. In some sense, this is a period that many have expressed nostalgia to in terms of the the global, or at least sort of the high-income country economic performance. So, perhaps it is possible to do some partial repudiation on debt, not in the model of the intra-war period, but in the model of the post-war period that coincides not with the Great Depression, but with a period of high growth. So that's kind of one point on inflation and debt that I wanted to raise. And then I wanted to pick up on the innovation, and specifically, Harold mentioned the aviation industry. And indeed, if you look at the aviation industry in the intra-war, or the pre-Second World War period, this picture on the left here, it was sort of a hobby for rich people. It was not really of much commercial use, except in airmail. The airmail industry began to appear in the intra-war period, but you don't hear about people, flying on vacation. If you look at the post-war period, my casual observation is that the typical American movie of the 1950s is Americans having a lot of fun on the French Riviera or in Italy. And, this is still kind of a little bit of a rich person's game at this point. But nevertheless, we exited the Second World War with a very active commercial aviation industry, the example that Harold gave notwithstanding. And this really was an artifact of enormous government investment in this industry. My question really here is, if there is an analogy to our current period in the sense of, are any of the medical equipment or medical advances that will come out certainly from this period of public investment, will they have the same scale of commercial potential? And as Harold pointed out, it's very important, after the initial public investment, to let the free market do its job in kind of unleashing the creativity of that industry. So I'll do a little bit of shameless advertising of some work I am currently working on. This is research I'm doing on the aviation industry in the Second World War in the United States. And without getting into a lot of detail, this kind of relies on a natural experiment of the United States moving production of aircraft across regions in the US due to fears of aerial bombing on the coasts. And so it uses that as a sort of natural experiment to see what additional government expenditure on aircraft does to the productivity of aircraft companies. And what we see here is the response to a 1%, and these are months on the x-axis, the response of total factor productivity to a 1% increase in government purchases of airplanes at on a specific production line. So this is very granular information. And what we see that total factor productivity, and you can go on, this is quite persistent, increases quite rapidly. So productivity increases quite rapidly to respond to government demand for new products. And this is not even talking about innovation across products, so creating new products, but this is kind of within product line. Almost 50% of the government demand for aircraft in the United States was met by productivity enhancements during this period. So I very much agree with Harold's Harold's point that this tragedy could be the mother of innovation in similar productivity enhancing ways. Finally, on a slightly perhaps less optimistic note, also work that I have in progress with my student Hugo Reichardt is the makeshift ventilator factories that we're now seeing emerging. Now, I don't know enough about the ventilator industry to know if there are analogies from aircraft production to ventilator production. But what I would say as a word of caution is that in the Second World War, despite very good PR by the auto industry, that they contributed a lot to the war effort, they actually were extremely, extremely slow in responding. And there's a lot of historical documentation of all the failures of the auto industry to actually live up to the promises they made early in the war in producing motors and for the aircraft industry and complete aircraft. So, the famous American tale is about Ford Willow Run, but we forget that at the time, the joke was that this is Ford Will It Run, because they didn't really believe that Ford would be able to come to this. And what we see here is that in blue, we see the aircraft manufacturer's production of B-24 bombers, and here we see Willow Run did eventually produce quite a lot, actually, close to 50% at peak of the aircraft of this specific type. But here in the red line is when the Willow Run factory was first established. Here in the next red line is when Willow Run first started producing aircraft. And you'll see that it's, even from that point, it's another 2 years almost until the US government actually received any aircraft from this auto manufacturer. So it looks like the time to convert a auto manufacturer to an aircraft manufacturer is along the lines of 3 years. And again, I don't know the technologies well enough to comment on this, but the analogy is obvious that we are kind of asking a lot of corporations that aren't really specialized in ventilator making to do this. The strategy during the Second World War that was much more successful was simply to give far more resources to those corporations, those plants that already had the human capital in place to produce the products that we needed. So a word of caution on Hoover makers producing ventilators.
Thank you, Ethan. That was excellent compliment to Harold's presentation. Should we? I'll try now to take questions, and as I said, if you could introduce yourself and your affiliation when you speak. Also, for those who don't speak, please mute your mics. So, do we have any questions? I have a question from Christine Cho. Is Christine Cho on? You're muted. You have to unmute.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Wonderful.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Now you're
Fantastic.
muted.
My name is Christine Chow. I've 20. Huh?
Go ahead.
Is this working now?
Yep.
Great. I am in the Court of Governors of the LSE. I've also had 24 years of experience in investment management. My question is here. The first question is related to, I think that what is we haven't included in the conversation so far is a new factor that influence how the society responds to government, but also vice versa is the big T, as in what is the technology impact to the crisis. Because increasingly we're seeing that technology obviously allows information to be disseminated more easily, but at the same time we see technology to trace people, and in some markets they are color coding those who are safe and not safe. And initially we've seen that happening in China, which is more acceptable to the society. But a couple of days ago, it also appears in the BBC that the UK government is considering that as well. So my question is, besides the economic impact or likely economic impact that we might see as a result of this crisis, what might be the impact on the role of the state and also the perception of data privacy, which has been they're going very well, driving by the EU, and now maybe because of public health security, that data privacy expectations would need to be curtailed. And what is your expectation of this development? Thank you.
So let me take one more question while you reflect on this one from Yuri Kazakov.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much to both presenters. I'm from New York. I'm a graduate student at the History Department at Columbia University. And my question is that both of the speakers mentioned the aviation industry as a post-war economic restructuring example. And my question along that line is, would we see increased dominance of large internet providers like Amazon, not because of a specific industrial policy, perhaps, but because of its already large pre-crisis role in the starvation of many small businesses during this lockdown? And on a related note, will we move to a sort of a work from home economy as it becomes apparent that many service occupations can be done remotely via Zoom? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuri. Our own Piroshka Noj-Mohachi, please, Piroshka.
And thank you, Harold and Ethan, for the outstanding presentations. My first question would be the outlook for populism. On the one hand, one would have hoped that expert advice will gain much more currency in the current context, and populists not relying on those would fall. But on the other hand, we see countries such as my original own Hungary, where populist leaders really take advantage of the situation and introduce additional restrictive powers. So So how you see, Harold, the outlook, what is the balance that is being drawn here? And second, if I may, Eric, if there's time, sort of how you see how global institution, the whole globalization process will be emerging from this crisis. Second World War gave birth to the Bretton Woods institutions. Do you see something something fundamentally new potentially emerging as well this time around? Thank you.
Okay, you have four quite different questions, but maybe you can select a couple of them and comment, and then Harold, you start, and then Ethan covers up for you.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, actually, four just terrific questions. Very, very central questions. Excuse me, could if you're not speaking, could you mute the microphone? It's coming in a rather loud form to me. And thank you. The first question, Dr. Cho's question, I think is really fundamental. In that those advances in medical technology that I was thinking of, they do depend on sacrificing some measure of privacy. So I think, for instance, how medicine is likely to develop, telemedicine, having diagnostics that are linked to my computer so that the computer will measure basic things, pulse rates, oxygen rates, blood sugar levels, white platelet levels. You can think of what it will do. And that information is useful only if it's aggregated and if it's used to rapidly identify, for instance, where future pandemics are emerging. If people are really hooked up in this way to a centralized medical system, you will be able to identify very, very quickly where a future variant, for instance, of the coronavirus could be starting to operate. And that's in part what I meant when I said that curve of how many fatalities there are overall, what the rate of infection is, how far the rate of infection is increasing. Those will be used widely as a measure of the effectiveness of government responses. And where information is widely shared, the government response is going to be indeed be more effective. And so I think that's a legitimate question that will be put to voters, to politicians in various countries in Europe. Are you willing to maintain a level of data protection that makes you less effective in responding to this kind of emergency? At the moment, if we look at the world, we think of China as being least concerned with data protection, and Europe being at the most concerned level. If it really turns out that Europe has a poor response to the coronavirus because of concerns over data protection, then I think there will be a push to modify that. The second question from Mr. Kazakov, I think is a good question. You know, how far is it necessary that this is done by public agencies? How far is a lot of the work in coordinating data being done by private data providers, platforms, corporations? You mentioned Amazon. And one of the consequences of the, you know, even of what we've seen so far, is that the pricing models of those big platforms will be discussed. So I don't know how intensively you've monitored the prices on Amazon, but you can see that prices of some kind of basic commodities have really shot up. So that was part of the discussion that Ethan had. He looked at the world market prices for wheat, but if you look at the price for breakfast cereals on Amazon, some of them have really escalated because they're set by a simple algorithm, whereas in the local store they're kept constant. And at the moment, when we're thinking about the need for basic provision, I think there will be a sense that local stores have behaved more transparently, and it will, I think, generate a push. And that's again a question of regulation. It's a very, very important question that's at the key of the agenda. How the pricing models of internet platforms and corporations are managed, what are the algorithms behind them, and then that would be an intense regulatory issue. And finally, the question of populism and the response, Piroshka's question. You're seeing leaders who I think are thought of as populist behaving in some rather peculiar ways. So, an extreme outlier, I think, is the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil. It looks as if the mismanagement there is going to harm his political position. And in general, I would come back to the sense that this is a real test of the competence of governments and of administrative machineries. If you've spent a lot of time trying to dismantle governments and administrative machineries because you think that they're representative of a deep state, you're likely to get into trouble. And we've already seen there's a lot of this discussion in the United States because the CDC has effectively been scaled back in the Trump administration. That looks as if it's one of the things that is providing for a weaker response than there could have been. The CDC was a really, really very effective institution, but it's been scaled back. And so when we think of this, the demand for governments that can provide competent responses is I think fundamentally a very, very different kind of story than the demand for governments that can produce simple messages, which was the heart of the populist appeal. The populist appeal was trying to distill things down into a very simple message, protect the people. But if you can actually show, and that's where, again, data is going to be very, very sensitive, because these questions of the rates of infection, the rates of mortality, are intensely political questions. And so there's likely to be a lot of concealing, and we already see the discussion, has China concealed some of the mortality from the coronavirus?
I can't help bringing up Piroshka's second question, because I mean, you are also the sort of official historian of the IMF, and of course you talk now about competence at the level of national governments, but if you think about the global level, and it took a long time for the IMF after it was created to really play any meaningful role. And of course, out of the global financial crisis, it came out quite a lot stronger. Right now, it has, I think, more than 85 official requests and a number of others coming probably. How do you think the IMF will come out of this?
Well, I think indeed there really is, as I tried to lay out in the presentation, a need for the effective monitoring of information on an international level, on a global level as well. And there's an absolute crisis demand. So two very, very different sorts of demand on international institutions. But we're going to be living, I believe, still in a world in which goods come from one country to another country. It's an important part of the international division of labor. Pharmaceuticals are made in one place. They need to be sold to other places, but countries need to be secure that they're not going to be cut off in an emergency. So maintaining an international trading system, maintaining an international open economy is, I think, a very, very important part of the crisis response and the post-crisis response.
Ethan, do you want to add anything?
No, so I don't have much to add. I'll just on Piroshka's question on the international order. I mean, it required it required a lot of will among the world leadership and a very, very big shock of the Second World War to create the institutions. I mean, we saw the intra-war failure of that, and Roosevelt was an internationalist at heart, and Pearl Harbor had killed essentially the isolationist movement in the United States. I don't really see yet, and in the United States, I don't really see yet an analogy to that.
I'm going to ask another round of, or let another round of 3 questions in. So this first, Vicky Price, then Tim Besley, and then Ollie Rain. Vicky? Yeah.
Is it okay now?
No.
Oh, yeah?
Yep.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much for this. We saw the little chart on productivity, but higher public sector doesn't necessarily, which we're going to have for a bit, doesn't necessarily mean higher productivity, of course. But what might lead to it is what was mentioned earlier by Harold as well, which is that ways of working might change. The worry that I have is that given the disruption that's taken place, will firms start really applying considerably more IT, AI, and so on, which really will mean at the end that the increase in employment we saw after the Second World War, of course, isn't going to happen, and we will have a permanently lower employment base because they will be substituted much faster than we all forecast by machines in order to avoid the disruption that we've seen because of the pandemic.
Thank you, Vicky. Tim?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, one small comment and then a question. The comment, which I'd like Harold and maybe Ethan, but by the way, thanks for excellent presentations, to comment on is, I think if you look at my reading of history is that the wars had a huge impact on the operation of the state as much as they did on the private economy. A good example would be in the area of tax policy, that direct withholding of taxation from people's pay packets was largely a wartime convenience, which then of course persisted after the war ended, and we routinely now comply with taxes that way. And I wonder, in a world where governments, many governments, because of globalization, were already struggling to hold their tax bases together, another part of this might be will have to be inevitably a redoubled effort to look for alternative and additional revenue sources for governments as they confront the reality of the debts they've incurred and figure out how to service those. So I don't know if you have a view on that. My question was really about, though, in terms of historical studies, when you look at the period over which governments were reacting within a war, nobody knew how long the war was going to go on in real time. So famously, people said the First World War, it'll all be over by Christmas. So presumably there's this kind of learning process that goes on through a period of war in which governments are gradually responding to events. And I think when we look at what's going on right now, we're going to see a lot of that. I mean, at the moment, we're being told maybe in 12 weeks, maybe it's September, maybe it's December, maybe even it's a year. But we're going to learn about that in real time, and government responses are clearly going to have to change according to which of those time horizons And as, of course, a lot of it is about managing the expectations of citizens, because what we're being asked to do perhaps is more palatable if we think it's a 3-month endeavor than if we think it's a 1-year endeavor. And I'd like to know, particularly from Harold's study of wartime economies, how did that play out, and to what extent are the things that government could only do at certain points in the cycle, principally because people were beginning to become used to the fact that this was not going to be over by Christmas?
Okay, Tim. Ollie?
Thank you, Eric. Many thanks to Harold and Ethan for excellent, very thoughtful presentations. My question concerns the experience and scenery of financial repression with growth, not deflation. And now, if you look at the post-World War II period, the Bretton Woods international order consisted of trade liberalization, but restrictions on capital movements with fixed but adjustable exchange rates, as we know. And this, at that period, seemed to have facilitated very strong recovery and economic growth. So what is your view? Could the current support such kind of recovery with some sort of financial repression? The central banks are, of course, doing whatever it takes, but we are still in the world of free capital movements for good reasons, probably, in the world of central bank independence with price stability mandates. So what should change in the international economic order to facilitate, say, a broader-based post-pandemic economic recovery? Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie. Harold, you have another round of big questions.
Yes. Well, in the order that the questions came, so Vicky Price's question about whether the post-crisis environment is going to produce a surge of investment in machines that will displace humans. So in effect, that's a kind of discussion that we've been having for the last 20 years already. Is there likely to be a lot of unemployment as a result of technology? I think you're right that certain processes are going to be much where there are clear benefits to having machines rather than people. So a lot of the things that nurses are doing in hospitals with exposing themselves to tremendous risks, it turns out, in the middle of the virus. That I think is one of the possibilities of the kind of telemedicine that I'm thinking of. It gets replaced. Supermarket checkouts, again, there's a lot of discussion about the safety of supermarkets at the moment. If you go over to the greater use of machines, does that eliminate risk and make it a safer place? I think it may do. So the push for safety is going to be one of the things that pushes in the direction of using machines more than people. But so far, I think the lesson has been that there are always new activities that develop, and they're often quite different. But that if they're really genuinely productivity enhancing investments, what happens is then that there are more incomes available and more spending available for other things. And so exactly that, I think, is going to be at the center of the optimistic vision that I hope we have of how responding to a crisis gives us a moment where we can think about basic problems and think how effectively all the knowledge and all the innovative capacity can really push you to a better solution. Then the second question from Jim, I think, about
former colleague.
I'm sorry. Of course, I'm so sorry. I misheard. I didn't see the picture, so I couldn't identify you. Of course. Nobody knows how long the emergency is going to last. That's absolutely right. And that's I think one of the reasons why it's very important to think about what we do in the post conflict or post virus environment while we're still in the middle of it. And if you think back, for instance, to the Bretton Woods story, the Bretton Woods conference was in July 1944. And that was a moment, it was just after the Normandy landings, and where the Allied armies were moving across France very, very quickly. And so there was a realistic thought in the summer of 1944 that the war in Europe, at least, might be over by the end of the summer, or certainly by the end of the year. And so it was really important to have the post-war order in place before you actually stop the conflict. And I think that is a good historical lesson, that kind of thinking worked much better than the terrible peace conference of 1919 after the end of the conflict, where all the factionalism and all the nationalism is really pulling apart. And it was much, much harder as a result to get a stable and productive peace settlement. And I think it's also the case that you can think of ways in which the kind of techniques that we need to respond to the crisis are also ones that are going to be of relevance afterwards. Medicine was one example, but another one I think is the question of fintech. Are we going to be much less dependent on conventional cash? That might be really a strong lesson of the crisis. If you're thinking about how to pay basic entitlements in order to get, I think I wanted to emphasize a little bit in the presentation how important it is that everybody has access to resources and that people are not cut off from food or from housing because of the loss of activity in the middle of the crisis. But if you think of the mechanisms that are needed to provide them with that kind of provision of resources, what kind of electronic material would be put on smartphones, what happens to people who don't have smartphones, how can they be brought in? Those are questions that are going to be relevant afterwards as well. So both on the macro level of planning an international system that is still open to trade, and on the micro level of what it takes to manage ordinary everyday life. I think the crisis is doing something. And Ollie Rain's questions about the what is going to happen to free capital movements. I think if you imagine likely scenarios after the crisis of problems with private sector debt or problems with public sector debt, an immediate consequence of that is to try to limit capital movements. That's part of the story of the European crisis after 2010, that there's a kind of effective renationalization of European markets, macroprudential regulation is also limiting capital movements. It goes back to a question in the first round. You know, also the question in this round about taxation. How do you manage it? Well, if it's really true that we're moving more in the direction of e-money, and then that also is a more visible kind of transaction in terms of the monitoring of the whole system, and it's much less liable to evasion than, say, the cash economy is.
Ethan, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just jump in with two brief comments. So on you know, Ali Ren asked about the post crisis, I guess, monetary and capital flow order. You know, so obviously I don't know, and I hope that we will continue with you know, or this will be an impetus, if anything, for more international cooperation rather than nationalism. But you know, the reason I began my comments on the topic of inflation has to do with the point you made on this whatever it takes of the central banks, because in March or April of 2020, it's a no-brainer for central banks to say we'll do whatever it takes and implicitly monetarily finance budgets, etc. If we do see 10% inflation in the midst of 20% unemployment, which is not an impossible scenario half a year from now, then central banks' commitment to inflation stability will really be put to a test. And I have to say that the whole inflation targeting experience was only really tested in a period where global inflationary pressures were extremely low for the past 20, 30 years. And I really wonder how central banks are going to truly, when they really are made to make these very hard decisions, what will they actually do? And I don't have an answer to that, but I think that will be something that I'm very curious as to how it will go. And just a small comment on Tim's point. Well, I mean, Tim, you're no one understands fiscal capacity better than you, so I would defer to you on that issue. But I do wonder whether the tax side is the only side we should be looking at, in the sense that in European governments have tax revenues to GDP that are many over 50%. Enforcing more taxes, I don't think there's so much scope there. But I do think we're going to demand, perhaps we will demand more effectiveness of our government on the expenditure side, and of really understanding where the money goes, and that it's really being used in productive ways.
Okay, thank you. So I will have one more round at least. So I'll have another colleague, Markus Brunnemeyer. I have Khalid Abdullah Yanahi, and I have Beata Jaworczyk. Markus.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for two excellent speeches by Harold and Ethan. I have two quick questions. One is about, it came out, if I make it a little bit more black and white, the future is like we have high inflation or we have financial repression. And I would like to get a more clear picture on that. What does financial repression mean for the liberal order of capital flows, for international flows? And also, if it is more financial repressions or not, is there a big difference? Do we see the world split further apart between governments which can issue safe assets and which governments which can't? And governments which can't issue safe assets, they have to live with high inflation and also a much smaller reaction to the budget. As we saw, Italy is spending only 1% of GDP, Germany is spending 4% of GDP in order to fight the current events. And then I have a historical question. If you look back in various crises, war versus the plague and so forth, some really lead to a huge destruction of physical capital, and the other one mostly about human capital. Can we say something across that line, that if the destruction of human capital is much more severe than the destruction of physical capital? Do we have any evidence to which ones lead to an outcome down the road. Thanks.
Thank you. Very important question, of course, the second one. The both, but the second one particularly. Khalid?
Thank you very much, Eric. Excellent presentations. I'd like to change the perspective for Harold from just talking about technicality of numbers to some realities that we have on ground and how it would affect. I'm going to have two questions after just make this quick premise. Post World War II, we had one of the successes was the leadership at the time. Today, this is of course my perspective, my opinion, that we lack effective leadership. Well, let me put it, we have an effective leadership deficit across sort of be it at country level or at other levels. We have it, and that of course it's enhanced due to the technological advancements, or there is real time now. You see any leader in any position is basically assessed on a real-time basis, which makes life more difficult for that particular leader. But that is one factor which is there with what's going on. Number two is basically what our human rights aspects for individuals. I mean, we look at post 9/11, certain rules were put in the United States, which were effective for that particular period, but we still those rules are still going on as of today. Plus, what you see turning around is with all what's going on in what I would call the liberal world, the democratic world, we see now a bit of autocratic aspect coming in with what's going on now, which is expected, but with that stay or go away. Now, with those three things there, now, as a historian, let me just make it simple. Globalization, before the crisis, say it was at a zero level. Now, looking at medium and long term, do you see it -5 getting really bad, +5 be it actually getting in a good position? That's number one. And number two, what are the chances, if the chances were zero before the crisis, of having a silly war between the two super economic powers, how much this crisis actually is going to enhance or not the chances of a silly war happening between the two?
Thank you. And Beata?
You have mentioned that we are fighting an invisible enemy, and yet many leaders, or some leaders, talk about a Chinese virus. Will politicians be tempted to find an enemy, particularly politicians in whose countries are not dealing very successfully with the pandemics? And if so, what will be the consequences of that?
Harold?
So great. So can I start with the last two questions, because they're really related. So the level of international conflict, the precariousness of it. So if you go back to the world of 1945, I'm not sure that I quite agree with the point that Khalid made about the good leadership, because you know, the story of 1945 is that the two big democracies who were in the war, Britain and the United States, Britain had a leader, very effective, inspirational person who really held the country together in the war, who was then voted out in an election, and President Roosevelt died. So there was an inexperienced leader in the United States who had no knowledge of the development of the atomic program, a new leader in the UK, there was Stalin in Russia, increasingly paranoid. It was actually terrible leadership. But what had happened in 1944 in the preparations was that a structure had been built up that was capable and resilient enough of dealing even with bad leaders. And you know, that's in a way what we really need. We need a system that is so resilient that it can't be blown up by a temporary spat between Xi and Trump. And that's the hope of an institutional multilateral world order. So Beata is absolutely right. Leaders are going to try to blame the crisis on somebody else. There's a discussion in Europe about whether the supplies are going properly from one country to another. There's the discussion that Beata mentioned about whether it's a Chinese virus or not. I mean, these are incredibly distracting and really unhelpful discussions. So, in part, I think part of the benefits of having a discussion like this is that one can really focus on the kind of longer term aspects of it and what is needed for stability. And I think that's where Marcus's questions are fundamental. Can all governments produce safe assets? Obviously they can't. The governments that can produce safe assets are in a better position. Again, this is a pre-crisis discussion. Marcus was at the center of that pre-crisis discussion. You need to be able to have safe assets in order to be able to do the things that we expect public authorities to do in an emergency. If that isn't the case, then rapidly you do get into the world of the unsafe assets of the post-war Hungarian, Austrian currencies in the early 1920s, and that's not a world in which you want to be. So, it's one instance where there are discussions that have been going on before the crisis that are really useful now in terms of guiding our post-crisis response. And one of the interesting aspects, and it's obviously one, Marcus, that you've been thinking about, is the question, can you have a safe asset that's provided by a network, an institutional system that is not a government? And could that provide some of the stabilizing functions? So again, if you take the question of big providers of technology, of information, can they produce that kind of safe assets? That might be also a benefit for the future if that were a possibility.
So I'll just respond to Marcus's very good questions. Those were the ones that were kind of within my my sphere of knowledge. I agree, Marcus, that financial repression is far less of a likely tool as long as capital mobility is truly free. But again, inflationary finance is a possibility. On the safe asset issue, maybe I'm being a wet blanket here again, but the concern I am starting, that I'm starting to have is, we have to recall that an asset safety is an endogenous concept. It really is in the eye of the beholder, of the investors in that asset. And once we have these safe assets being issued at the rates, at percentages of GDPs that we haven't really seen for a very long time, the question is whether the shift of what is perceived to be a safe asset or not could also change. I mean, the UK bonds are safe assets at 80% of GDP, but are they safe assets at 200% of GDP? I mean, we'll have to see. But I'll second Harold's comment that your work on not only academic but also policy on trying to promote European wide safe assets would be a major contribution to the ability of European governments to cope with this crisis.
I can help to follow up on Marcus's second question on the impact on human capital and the impact on physical capital. Harold, can you say something?
Yes, I mean that's exactly, I think, the distinction between the plagues and the wars. That the wars involved a massive destruction of conventional physical capital, and the plagues really were more devastating in terms of the human capital that they took away. And the aftermath of the plague is much more fundamental. It really is very, very destructive, and particularly if it's regionally selective. So the regions that are badly affected suffer from a permanent loss, whereas the destruction of physical capital is actually something that gives a chance for modernization. And so if we think of it goes back to the question that Ethan started in the discussion about whether all these ventilators that are produced now are going to be produced in enough numbers. Well, I mean, the question is not really producing large numbers of ventilators in the long run, but it's a question of whether you get the skills in order to retool factories quickly. And that's something that could potentially be a great stimulus.
If I could just kind of quickly make a comment, because one concern I have about the analogy with these large-scale plagues is that our responses to this pandemic have been quite different, and as such, the loss in human life, as tragic as it is not going to be anywhere close to the scale of no country is going to see more than 1% of its population die because of this. But I think Marcus's point on human capital, that truly may be the capital. It's not the labor or the physical capital that is being destroyed in this crisis, but the human capital with many people not being able to go to work and develop those skills or employ those skills. And I am a little concerned that a loss of human capital doesn't have an analogy to physical capital, in that that is more of a permanent damage and not one that recovers quickly after the crisis.
Right. It's obviously going to have very different effects on different generations, and so the students who are graduating at the moment are obviously going to go into a very, very uncertain world, a very different world than the one that people who graduated 20 or 30 years go into. And so that's a question where there's a human capital which has enormous potential, but if the wrong kind of policy choices are taken, may be wasted, and that would be a terrible loss.
I'm very conscious of time here, and unfortunately there are a lot of people who wanted to ask questions, but there just won't be time to have any more questions. So I want to thank you for I think was the most illuminating and thought-provoking discussion, and we very much hope that we can come back to you later as we learn more from this crisis. I think we are all in very steep learning curves, both about epidemiology and about the consequences for the economy and for the political system and for social matters as well. I don't want to summarize by any stretch, but I think I took away one thing which I came back a number of times, of course, the role of government, how that changes in a crisis, and we will have to see how that continues beyond the crisis. I think what this crisis, we know, and came out of Harold's presentation very well, that this is a kind of crisis that's going to take a long time to peter out, because even when we are through the worst part of the epidemiological cycle, this will continue, and there will be a role for government throughout that process as well. So that certainly is something that we need to watch and understand. I think that was one thing that took away that was hopeful, and I think encouraging for for those of us who are trying to find international solutions, global solutions, that we should do that during the crisis, or at least before the crisis is all over and when you are into this kind of phases where it's about recrimination and blaming people who what was done wrong and so on. I think the fact that we now have an opportunity to maybe put in place some of the institutions and the mechanisms that we need to deal with this in the future, I think is encouraging. And we know from previous crises that there have been real institutional improvements from those. So again, thank you very much for this, and I hope that all of those who joined, there was a very large group of people from all around the world, and it's very impressive that you all stayed with us for so long. So thank you very much, and be safe and stay healthy. Thank you.